December 30th, 2006. Baghdad is silent. The city that once trembled under his voice now whispers only echoes. In a dim concrete chamber, a rope sways gently in the stale air. Cameras hum, soldiers hold their breath, and a man who once called himself the Lion of Babylon stands still beneath the noose. For a moment, he does not look afraid. Perhaps he believes history will still fear him even when he is gone. He murmurs words no one can clearly hear, a prayer or maybe a curse, and then the trapdoor opens. Silence again. No speeches, no gunfire, just the sound of boots against the floor and the faint creak of an ending. Outside, dawn rises over the ruins of a nation once drenched in oil and blood. His statues lie broken, his palaces looted, his portraits burned. Yet his shadow still lingers, in the dust and the memory of those who lived under his rule. This is not the story of a tyrant alone. It is the story of a country, a people, and a man who mistook fear for power. His name was Saddam Hussein, and this is how his empire of sin began to crumble. He was born beneath the sun-scorched skies of Tikrit in a dusty village that barely had a name, where the air smelled of sand and sweat and despair. The year was 1937. The river Tigris moved slowly there, like a tired serpent. His mother, Sabha, wept when she gave birth, not from joy but from fear. She had already lost her husband and her first son before this child came into the world. And in the small clay house where grief had no space left to breathe, the boy named Saddam entered life as a replacement for the dead. His father, Hussein al-Majid, was gone. Some said he vanished in the desert. Others said he was murdered. His mother, drowning in sorrow, tried to kill herself before the child could even walk. It was his uncle, Kerala Talfa, who rescued her, and later, who would raise Saddam in his own shadow. From that moment, the boy grew up not with love, but with lessons and survival, the kind that left scars invisible to the eye. He learned early that the world belonged to those who took it. When other boys played with sticks, Saddam carried stones. When they laughed, he watched in silence. His eyes, dark, patient, calculating, missed nothing. The village elders used to say that the boy didn't just look at you, he measured you. Every word, every weakness. He was not cruel yet, but cruelty was already waiting for him like a seed buried in the sand. By the time he was 10, he had already learned to use fear as a weapon. His mother's temper was a storm, unpredictable and wild. She screamed at him, hit him, then cried and begged forgiveness. That chaos became his education. From her, he learned that love could be violent and power could be tender. He would remember that contradiction for the rest of his life. Kerala, the uncle, was a man of ambition. Once an army officer, later a nationalist dreamer, he filled the boy's head with tales of ancient Babylon, of kings and empires, of Arabs betrayed by colonizers and kings who ruled with divine purpose. One day, he told Saddam, "Our people will rise again, but only through strength." The child listened. He never forgot. When he first went to school in Tikrit, he was mocked for being poor. He had no shoes, only dust on his feet and pride in his chest. The other children laughed at his accent, his rough manners, his silence. One day, a boy insulted his mother. Saddam waited until dusk, followed him home, and broke his arm with a rock. He didn't run. He stood over the boy until adults pulled him away. That night, when his uncle heard what happened, he said only one sentence: "Good. Never let them forget your name." And they didn't. From then on, Saddam walked with the quiet arrogance of someone who believed destiny was already written, and written for him. He began reading books his uncle brought from Baghdad: history, politics, the Quran, military memoirs. He underlined passages about leadership and fear, and he memorized them. The boy who had nothing now dreamed of ruling everything. In 1955, at 18, he left Tikrit to join his uncle in Baghdad. The capital was a different world, full of soldiers, students, and conspiracies. The monarchy still stood, but the streets were full of whispers. The Ba'ath Party, a movement preaching Arab unity and socialism, was spreading among the youth. Saddam found in it what had been searching for: a place where ambition met ideology, where violence had purpose, and where the poor could become kings. He started as a messenger, delivering notes between conspirators, but even then, he acted like a commander. His eyes burned with certainty. He listened more than he spoke, People followed him without knowing why. There was something magnetic in his silence, something dangerous. And in a city of dreamers, he was one of the few willing to kill for his dream. One night in 1959, Saddam volunteered for his first assassination. The target, Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, the man who had toppled the monarchy and declared himself the voice of the people. The Baathists saw him as a traitor to Arab unity. Saddam saw him as a test. The attack failed. Bullets flew through the air like wasps. Qasim survived. Several conspirators were killed, and Saddam was shot in the leg. He escaped on foot, bleeding through the alleys of Baghdad, hiding in safe houses. Carried by fear and adrenaline, when he finally crossed into Syria, his wound had turned black, but his pride had never been stronger. He told his comrades later, "If I can survive death once, I can rule it." They laughed, but none of them doubted he believed it. In exile, he learned the art of patience. Damascus was full of revolutionaries, Egyptians, Iraqis, Palestinians, all talking of liberation, all plotting coups. Saddam didn't talk much. He watched. He studied how power moved between words and guns. He wrote letters to his uncle, promising to return, promising to rebuild Iraq in their vision. A country of discipline, he wrote, not weakness. He returned in secret a few years later, after the winds in Baghdad changed again. Another coup, another government, another chance. He joined the Baath underground, recruiting men from Tikrit, cousins, friends, loyal tribesmen. They called themselves the Tikriti Circle. Their loyalty was not to ideology, but to blood. Saddam understood that. He trusted blood more than belief. It was a rule he would carry to the presidency. But before power, there would be blood. In 1963, the Baathists finally seized control of Iraq for the first time. For a few chaotic months, they ruled with fire. Enemies were hunted in the streets, tortured in basements, shot in courtyards. Saddam, still a young operative, watched, learned, and remembered every method. He saw how fear could silence a city faster than law ever could. And he swore that when his turn came, he would do it better. Cleaner, colder, absolute. The coup collapsed within months. The old regime returned and the Baathists were purged again. Saddam was imprisoned. The cell was small, the walls thick, but even in prison he was not broken. He wrote notes, organized, whispered plans through the bars. Guards began to respect him. Prisoners began to follow him. A man who commands in chains, one of them said, will command in freedom. And so he did. In 1966, he escaped. Some said he bribed the guards, others said he crawled through a sewer. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he emerged from the darkness with a new certainty. He was chosen. Every loss, every wound, every death, all of it was training. The boy who once broke a classmate's arm now dreamed of breaking nations. By the time he turned 30, Saddam Hussein had become more than a man. He was a mission. His childhood had taught him that love was weakness, that mercy was suicide, and that fear was the only true currency of power. The first blood he spilled was not his last. It was only the beginning, the first chapter of a reign that would one day drench an entire country in silence. He returned to Baghdad in the shadows. The city had changed, but so had he. The air was thicker now, full of suspicion and whispered names. Iraq had become a land of plots and punishments, and Saddam Hussein was determined never again to be the hunted. From the first moment he stepped off the train, he moved like a man who owned the ground beneath him. He re-entered the Baath party quietly, finding that the old comrades who had once dismissed him now greeted him with careful smiles. They saw something different in his eyes. Not the hunger of an exile, but the stillness of someone who had looked into death and found it unimpressive. The party itself was fractured, torn between dreamers and soldiers. But Saddam had no interest in dreams. He wanted control. At first he worked behind the curtains, reorganizing the secret police, drawing maps of loyalty and betrayal. He recruited from his own bloodline men from Tikrit who owed him everything. They became his private army before the nation itself was his. In the cellars of party headquarters, he questioned dissidents, sometimes personally, sometimes through others. He never raised his voice. He preferred silence, broken only by the sound of paper being signed, confessions, orders. death warrants. His rise was not theatrical, it was surgical. Step by step, he positioned himself beside President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, an older man, a soldier with failing health and failing nerves. Bakr was a cousin, a connection of blood. Saddam became his protector, advisor, and shadow. Soon, no decree left the presidential office without Saddam's fingerprints. The 1970s opened with oil money and paranoia. Iraq was transforming. Skyscrapers, refineries, schools, a vision of progress dressed in military uniform. But beneath the slogans, fear was the real architect. Every neighborhood had an informer, every officer had someone watching him. Saddam perfected the art of invisible control. He called it order. Others called it terror. He smiled rarely, but when he did, it was deliberate, like a knife turning in light. In meetings, he sat slightly apart, never taking notes, letting others speak until they revealed too much. He believed that people destroyed themselves if you simply gave them time, and he was patient. In 1972, he oversaw the nationalization of Iraq's oil. Overnight, billions flowed into the state coffers and through them into his web of loyalty. Schools and hospitals were built, weapons bought, enemies silenced. The West looked on with approval. The Soviet Union sent engineers. Saddam shook hands with both, promising friendship to everyone and allegiance to no one. He was learning that power wasn't about ideology. It was about timing. Behind the public FOD, the prisons filled again. Torture rooms expanded. Intelligence networks thickened like roots beneath a tree. Files were kept on every minister, every officer, every poet who spoke too freely. The Ba'ath Party became less a movement and more a machine. And Saddam was its engineer. When al-Bakr's health began to fail, Saddam moved faster. He presented himself as the inevitable successor, the man who could keep Iraq united, disciplined. Feared. In July 1979, al-Bakr resigned, citing health reasons. Few believed it. Fewer dared to ask. Within hours, Saddam Hussein was sworn in as president of the Republic of Iraq. The streets erupted in choreographed celebration. Fireworks, flags, chants. The man from Tikrit had taken the throne, but he knew celebration was dangerous. Joy makes men careless. Fear keeps them useful. 2 weeks after his inauguration, he called a special meeting of the Ba'ath leadership. Hundreds of officials packed into a hall, cameras rolling. He took the stage, holding a stack of papers. His face was calm, almost kind. Then he began to read a list of names. One by one, men stood trembling as their names were called, accused of treason, of plotting with Syria, of betrayal. Guards dragged them out as the others watched. Some wept, some fainted, some applauded, hoping applause could save them. By the end of the meeting, dozens were gone, executed within hours. The rest pledged eternal loyalty. It was the perfect performance of fear, and the message was simple. Loyalty is survival. From that day, Saddam's rule became absolute. His portrait replaced the flag in many offices. His speeches played on radio mornings and nights. School children memorized his sayings. He created a cult of personality so dense that truth itself began to dissolve inside it. "I am Iraq," he declared, and many believed him, not because they loved him, but because the alternative was unthinkable. He rebuilt Tikrit into a symbol of his myth. Roads were named after him, palaces rose from the desert, statues multiplied. He rewarded tribes that praised him and erased those that did not. The Ba'ath Party, once ideological, became tribal again, centered on him, his cousins, his sons. Yet beneath the surface, insecurity gnawed at him. He saw enemies everywhere. In generals who smiled too confidently, in ministers who hesitated before answering. He trusted only family, and even then, only partially. His half-brothers controlled intelligence and security. His cousins oversaw the Republican Guard. Every man close to him was both servant and hostage. In public, he appeared fearless. In private, he moved between his residences every night, sleeping in different rooms. Fearing poison, fearing betrayal. He taped conversations, spied on his own bodyguards, replaced servants weekly. To rule through fear, he had to live inside it. The 1970s became his decade of triumph. Iraq's literacy rate soared, women entered universities, factories multiplied. To the world, he looked like a modernizer, a strong Arab leader standing against chaos. Western newspapers compared him to Ataturk, to Nasser, even to a pharaoh reborn. Saddam read every article. He clipped the flattering ones and underlined his name. But he knew that prosperity was fragile. Wealth makes nations restless. So he kept the country at a boil, inventing plots, announcing conspiracies, executing spies both real and imagined. The rhythm of fear became familiar, almost comfortable, and in that rhythm he began to think of legacy. He commissioned artists to paint his image as Saladin, the medieval hero who fought the Crusaders. He ordered a Quran to be written in his own blood, a grotesque offering to eternity. He filmed himself firing rifles, riding horses, kissing children. Every gesture was recorded, broadcast, repeated. The line between truth and theater disappeared completely. Those who met him privately spoke of contradictions. He could discuss poetry for an hour, then order an execution with the same calm tone. He quoted the Quran fluently, then mocked clerics. He laughed rarely, but when he did, it carried a chill. Even his friends never relaxed in his presence. One said later, when you spoke to him, you felt like standing at the edge of a well, deep, dark, and waiting. As the decade neared its end, the Middle East was shifting again. Iran, Iraq's ancient rival, had fallen into revolution. The Shah was gone, and in his place rose Ayatollah Khomeini, preaching Islamic zeal across borders. Saddam watched with fury. He saw the cleric's words spreading among his own Shia population like a spark in dry grass. He understood what was coming. A challenge to his rule, not from armies, but from belief. He began to prepare. Weapons, propaganda, alliances. His generals urged caution, but he was deaf to hesitation. Revolutions are contagious, he said. The cure is fire. By 1979, he was 42 years old, young, rich, feared, and utterly convinced of his destiny. He had risen from the dust of Tikrit to the palaces of Baghdad, from a barefoot boy to a man who could summon death with a phone call. But the higher he climbed, the narrower the air became. Paranoia followed him like a shadow that never slept. And as he stared across the border at Iran, he saw not just a threat, he saw opportunity. He imagined himself as the savior of the Arab world, the new Saladin who would crush Persia, unite the region, and rewrite history in his name. The soldiers saluted. The drums of war began to beat. And in the silence before the first shell fell, Saddam Hussein smiled, the same quiet smile that once crossed a boy's face in a dusty village. When he broke another child's arm, he believed destiny had come again to call his name. In September 1980, the horizon over the desert flared with fire. Tanks rolled, jets screamed, and Saddam Hussein announced to the world that Iraq would strike first. The target was Iran, a nation wounded by revolution, led by clerics who spoke in the language of holy war. Saddam called it a swift campaign, a defense of Arab honor. In truth, it was ambition clothed as destiny. He believed victory would be easy. His generals saluted. His speeches echoed through radio towers, promising triumph in weeks. "We shall drink tea in Tehran," he said. The soldiers cheered, and the cameras captured his smile. But deserts are not conquered by words. The war he unleashed would consume 8 years, 1 million lives, and the illusion of control. At first, Iraq advanced fast. Columns of armored vehicles pushed deep across the border. Cities fell, banners rose. Baghdad celebrated, fireworks painting the night sky. But then Iran recovered. Waves of young fighters, students, farmers, clerics, marched barefoot through minefields, shouting prayers and names of martyrs. They came not for land, but for heaven, and against that kind of faith, even bullets seemed to hesitate. The front lines froze. Trenches spread across the earth like open scars. Gas shells hissed in the wind. Entire villages vanished under chemical clouds. Saddam denied everything. "We defend ourselves," he said. "We are civilized." But the images told another story. Burned skin, blind eyes, children coughing blood. The world looked away. Oil still flowed, and that was enough. Inside Iraq, life turned into a parade of slogans and funerals. Posters of Saddam filled every wall, smiling, waving, promising victory. Schools taught children to chant his name before lessons. Women were told to give birth to soldiers. The economy became a weapon, ration cards replaced freedom. And yet, the streets stayed quiet. Fear was now routine. Every Friday, television showed the president visiting the front. He wore a khaki uniform, carried a rifle, and stood on the hood of a jeep as soldiers kissed his hands. "You fight for the homeland," he told them, "and I fight for you." Behind the camera, executions continued. Generals who failed, officers who doubted, poets who asked questions. The war dragged on. By 1984, both nations were bleeding. The Tigris carried bodies. The Euphrates carried rumors. But Saddam refused to retreat. "Endurance is victory," he said. He built new palaces while hospitals ran out of medicine. He built monuments to martyrs while mothers buried sons without names. Foreign powers played their own games. The United States, once his enemy, began sending aid and intelligence to stop Iran's advance. France sold him planes. The Soviets sold him tanks. The West saw in him a barrier against the revolution next door. He saw in them validation. "The world needs strong men," he said, "and I am one." By 1988, exhaustion finally forced peace. The borders returned to where they had begun. Nothing was gained, everything was lost. 1 million graves, $1 trillion, and a nation hollowed by sacrifice. Baghdad held parades anyway. Saddam stood on the balcony of the Grand Palace, saluting the widows and orphans he had made. "We won," he declared. But even his voice sounded tired. He should have rested then. He should have rebuilt. Instead, he looked south, toward the glittering oil fields of Kuwait. In the summer of 1990, the maps of his mind began to shift again. He accused Kuwait of stealing oil, of betraying Arab unity. But beneath the accusations lay the same hunger that had followed him since boyhood. The need to dominate, to be feared, to carve his name into history's stone. His advisors hesitated. The army was drained, the treasury empty. But he silenced them with one question. Who dares say no to Iraq? On August 2, 1990, Iraqi tanks crossed the border. In 2 days, Kuwait was gone. The world was stunned. Saddam appeared on television, smiling beside captured Kuwaiti princes. "Kuwait has returned to its mother," he announced. The applause in parliament was thunderous. But beyond Iraq's borders, silence turned into rage. The United Nations condemned the invasion. Sanctions fell like stones. And soon, the largest military coalition since World War I gathered on his doorstep: America, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. The desert filled again with armies, but this time not his. In January 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. Allied planes filled the sky, striking Baghdad with precision and fire. Palaces, bridges, factories, everything burned. Television showed the capital glowing red at night. In underground bunkers, families prayed as ceilings trembled. Saddam appeared on state TV wearing military uniform, reading verses, declaring that victory was near. The bombs answered him louder. In 43 days, it was over. Iraq's army, once the fourth largest in the world, lay in ruins. Columns of burnt tanks lined the highways, bodies scattered across the sand. Thousands of soldiers surrendered, starving, barefoot, broken. But Saddam survived. He crawled from the wreckage like a ghost refusing to die. The coalition stopped short of Baghdad, leaving him wounded but alive. He crushed uprisings in the south and north with brutal speed. Villages shelled, rebels hunted, mass graves filled. The world watched again and again did nothing. He called it victory. "We faced the world and we remain," he said, his voice echoing in empty halls. The illusion returned, thinner but intact. Propaganda replaced truth. Statues rose again. The television showed him feeding orphans, praying in mosques, shooting rifles into the air. His image was everywhere, his trust nowhere. The 1990s became a decade of silence. Sanctions strangled Iraq. Food was scarce, medicine scarcer. Children died by the thousands while the president's palaces multiplied. Marble fountains, golden domes, walls painted with his own face. He moved among them like a king in exile within his own kingdom. Foreign journalists who visited described to Iraqs, one hungry, one divine. The poor lined up for bread while servants polished chandeliers. In hospitals, doctors whispered curses. In the streets, people whispered prayers. And in the middle of it all, Saddam smiled from posters that said, "God protect our leader." He grew more unpredictable. One day generous, the next cruel. Ministers vanished overnight. Entire families disappeared. His sons, Houday and Qusay, became extensions of his madness, untouchable, violent, feared even by generals. Baghdad learned to live without hope, only habit. Yet in the depths of isolation, Saddam still dreamed of greatness. He compared himself to Nebuchadnezzar, to Saladin, to the prophets. He built a grand mosque shaped like his initials. He published books under pseudonyms, romantic tales where noble rulers triumphed over betrayal. In every story, the hero looked suspiciously like him. But the world was changing again. The Cold War had ended. America stood alone at the top, and its patience for dictators was running thin. Uninspectors came searching for weapons of mass destruction, the myth that would later decide his fate. Saddam played cat and mouse, expelling them, inviting them back, mocking them on live TV. Each gesture drew another line toward his downfall. By the late 1990s, he was a man trapped in his own mythology. Surrounded by yes-men, haunted by ghosts, he still believed himself untouchable. He built new statues, renamed streets, rewrote textbooks. The story of Iraq became the story of Saddam. Children who knew no other flag learned to draw his portrait before they could write their names. And yet, deep inside, something had cracked. Those who saw him up close noticed the difference. The slower walk, the quieter tone. The eyes that seemed to stare beyond the room. He had won every battle for power but lost the war for meaning. Still, he ruled. With fear, with symbols, with the memory of past terror. His iron grip had dulled, but it held. He told his ministers, "The hand of God is with me." They nodded, smiling. None dared remind him that God, too, sometimes turned his face away. The deserts that once echoed with tanks now lay silent, scarred, waiting. Iraq had become a museum of ghosts. The dead of Iran, the lost of Kuwait, the starving of sanctions, and somewhere in his palace, beneath chandeliers that glittered like false stars, Saddam Hussein looked into a mirror and saw not a man, but a myth slowly eroding. Outside, the world was moving toward a new century. Satellites circled. Cameras watched. In distant offices, new enemies studied his face and marked his name. The next war was already being written. The war was over, but the noise never stopped. Even when the bombs fell silent, their echoes lingered in every home, every market. Every child who woke at night hearing ghosts in the sky. Baghdad still stood, but it was not alive, it was surviving. And at its center, inside marble walls and endless mirrors, Saddam Hussein told himself that Iraq had won. He appeared on television more than ever. His mustache immaculate, his uniform pressed, his smile practiced. "We have endured," he said. "We are victorious." Around him, generals clapped, poets recited verses comparing him to prophets and kings. But outside the cameras, the streets were empty, the stores bare. The people whispered the truth only to each other, and even then, softly. The United Nations had locked its hands around Iraq's throat. Sanctions cut off medicine, trade, technology. Factories stopped. Hospitals starved. INFLATION devoured salaries until money was only paper. A sack of rice became worth a month's wage. Mothers sold jewelry to buy milk. Fathers sold furniture to bury children. The once mighty nation turned into a waiting room of hunger. Saddam called it the siege. He told the people that the world wanted to destroy them, that every hunger pang was an act of resistance. To suffer is to be strong, he declared, and in that suffering he hid his own sins. The cruelty of sanctions became the perfect disguise for the cruelty of his rule. While the poor searched for bread, the president built. Palaces rose from the dust like mirages. Marble columns, golden ceilings, fountains flowing with imported water while villages had none. Each palace had a name: Victory, Faith, Mother of all battles. He moved between them like a restless ghost, sleeping in one room tonight, another tomorrow, always afraid of what waited in the dark. His sons, Houday and Qusay, ruled their own empires within his. Houday, wild and cruel, collected cars and women and enemies. Qusay, quieter but no less brutal, managed the intelligence services, keeping track of every whisper, every face. They were princes of fear, trained by a father who trusted no one. not even them. In the early 1990s, Saddam began rewriting history again. He ordered new school books, lessons where his name appeared beside that of Saladin, Hammurabi, and the prophets. His portrait hung above every blackboard. Children were taught that Iraq existed because of him, that before him there had been chaos, and after him there would be nothing. Propaganda became oxygen. Television ran endless loops of his speeches. Songs praised his courage, his wisdom, his eyes. Newspapers published the same headline every day. Saddam leads, Iraq prevails. Even time seemed to revolve around him, the years measured by his survival. Yet within his circle, fear turned inward. Ministers spoke in rehearsed sentences. Generals smiled too widely. Each week brought new executions, new disappearances. One man would be honored on Friday and gone by Monday. The meetings smelled of perfume and sweat, the perfume to please, the sweat to hide fear. Foreign journalists who entered Iraq under strict escort saw contradictions everywhere. In one street, beggars fought for bread, in another, chandeliers glittered through palace windows. Western reporters whispered that Saddam had gone mad. But madness was too simple. He was not insane. He was trapped inside the architecture of his own power. To loosen it, even slightly, meant collapse. He turned increasingly to faith, or at least to its appearance. He ordered the construction of the great mother of all battles mosque in Baghdad, its minarets shaped like gun barrels pointing toward heaven. He recited the Quran on television, sometimes with tears in his eyes. Faith and strength, he said, are the same. But he also had the Quran written in his own blood, drop by drop, as a gift to God. A gesture that shocked even clerics. In 1996, the United Nations introduced the Oil for Food program, allowing Iraq to sell limited oil in exchange for humanitarian goods. It was meant to ease the suffering. Instead, it created new corruption. Saddam controlled the contracts, rewarding allies, punishing rivals, buying silence with barrels. His ministers grew rich, his people grew thin, and he convinced himself that this was order. He spent nights watching American news channels through satellite dishes hidden on palace roofs. He listened to the voices of his enemies in their own language, fascinated by their tone. He wrote notes in the margins of foreign newspapers, analyzing every word about him. They do not understand the East, he told his advisors. They think fear is weakness. They will learn. But the world was changing faster than his control could adapt. Across the borders, technology spread, the internet, mobile phones, satellite images. Information no longer needed permission to move. Iraq remained frozen in an earlier century, isolated, suspicious, decaying. His paranoia deepened. He replaced old guards weekly. He used doubles for public appearances, sometimes sending one to a mosque while he stayed hidden underground. His own family was divided, wives against wives, sons against uncles. The palace became a cage of mirrors where even he no longer knew which reflection was real. And yet, every morning, the national television still began with the same image. Saddam walking through gardens, stroking roses, smiling for the nation. He waved to children. He fed pigeons. The voice of the announcer trembled with devotion. Our leader, our father, our eternal president. For the people outside, watching on flickering screens powered by generators, it was theater. But it was also the only story they were allowed to believe. By the end of the decade, the sanctions had achieved what bombs could not: the quiet destruction of spirit. Young Iraqis dreamed only of leaving. Scientists drove taxis, teachers sold cigarettes, soldiers polished the ruins of tanks. A whole generation grew up knowing only fear and scarcity. And still, Saddam stayed. In his speeches, he spoke of destiny, of patience, of survival as victory. The lion rests but never sleeps, he said. He convinced himself that the world had grown tired of punishing him, that time was his ally once again. He even allowed Western companies small contracts, gestures of reconciliation. He smiled for cameras with diplomats, pretending peace had returned. But peace built on illusion is only a pause between storms. In 1998, the UN inspectors came again, demanding access to military sites. He refused, expelled them, invited them back, then expelled them again. Each act fed suspicion abroad. Each defiance strengthened his myth at home. Let them search, he told his aides. They will find nothing except fear. He watched as American presidents changed. Bush, then Clinton, and believed himself stronger for outliving them. But across the ocean, files were growing thicker. Words like regime change began to appear in speeches. His defiance, once admired by some Arabs, now looked like arrogance. His allies turned silent. The century turned. New towers rose in other lands, and one morning in 2001, those towers fell. The world trembled again, and though Saddam had nothing to do with it, he smiled bitterly when he saw the images. Now they will know fear, he said, but he did not understand that fear, once unleashed, does not obey borders. For 2 years, rumors multiplied. American planes circled the no-fly zones. Diplomats warned, begged, threatened. Saddam remained unmoved. He gave interviews declaring that Iraq was strong, that no invader could survive its deserts. His words carried the same conviction that had guided him through every disaster, the belief that survival itself was victory. By 2003, he was 66 years old, his hair grayer, his eyes heavier, but the fire inside him unbroken. He still believed history owed him one more miracle. He stood before mirrors rehearsing speeches about defiance, as if words could hold back armies. He told his generals to prepare for anything, but secretly, he no longer trusted them. The palaces glittered under desert sun. The statues stood tall, their bronze faces calm. The television still called him father of the nation. But beyond the walls, the earth was trembling. Troops gathered on the horizon, fleets assembled on the sea, and satellites focused on Baghdad's golden domes. Saddam Hussein walked through the halls of the Republican Palace, his footsteps echoing through marble corridors built by fear. He paused before a map of Iraq, touched it lightly, and whispered something only he could hear. Perhaps it was a prayer. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps both. He did not yet know that the illusion of peace was over. The next chapter of his life, and the final one of his rule, was already on its way, carried by engines, by lies, by destiny itself. The spring of 2003 arrived without color. The desert air hung heavy with dust, and the sky above Baghdad felt too wide, too silent, as if waiting for something enormous to descend. The world already knew what was coming. The armies had gathered. The speeches had been made. The United States called it Operation Iraqi Freedom. Saddam Hussein called it the Second Crusade, and both sides believed God was with them. In March, the first sirens wailed. Missiles traced burning lines through the night, shattering palaces, bunkers, radio towers. Baghdad glowed red again, a terrible beauty the city had already seen too many times. Inside the presidential compound, Saddam watched the flashes through bulletproof glass. He wore his uniform, the same green jacket he had worn for decades, as if fabric could hold power together. On television, he appeared calm. Iraq will never kneel, he said. This land has buried invaders before. His voice was firm, rehearsed, and yielding. But behind the cameras, confusion reigned. Orders contradicted orders. Commanders vanished. Communication collapsed. The army that once boasted of millions now stood hollow, hungry, unpaid, frightened. Within days, American troops crossed the Kuwaiti border and thundered north. British forces moved from the south. Airstrikes fell with mathematical precision. The Republican Guard, once his pride, melted into the sand. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Baghdad's defenses crumbled faster than anyone had imagined. Saddam refused to believe it. They will tire, he said. We will bleed them. He demanded counterattacks from units that no longer existed. He summoned generals who were already dead or captured. His inner circle nodded, saluted, disappeared. Only his sons remained, Houday raging, Qusay silent, each trying to appear stronger than the other, each afraid to tell their father the truth. The capital fell into chaos. Looters filled the streets, prisons open, fire devoured ministries, museums, libraries. Centuries of history turned to ash while American tanks rolled past cheering crowds and burning cars. Statues toppled. The giant bronze effigy of Saddam in Firdos Square came down beneath ropes and hammers. The head dragged through the dust. Cameras caught every second. Around the world, millions watched the fall of a man who once believed himself eternal. But Saddam was not in the palace when it fell. He had already vanished. Intelligence agencies hunted him through the deserts, the villages, the date palm groves of the Tigris. Rumors spread faster than troops. He was in Syria, in Tikrit, in a mosque, in a grave. Leaflets promised rewards. Loudspeakers blared messages. Saddam, your time is over. He answered none of them. In truth, he was hiding in plain sight, moving between safe houses disguised. Sleeping on straw mats, his beard untrimmed, his face thinner. He traveled with only a few loyal guards and a briefcase full of money and tapes. Each tape carried his voice, recorded speeches urging Iraqis to resist. They were broadcast across the ruins, ghostly echoes of a leader who no longer ruled anything. For months, he lived like a fugitive. The man who had built 100 palaces now slept in cellars and farm huts. He ate bread and onions, bathed with cold water, read the Quran by candlelight. Still, he believed history might turn again in his favor. Empires fall too, he told a guard. America will tire, and then I will return. But his empire was already gone, dissolved in smoke, betrayal, and silence. His sons were killed first. In July 2003, Houday and Qusay died in a firefight in Mosul. Their bodies were displayed on television, bullet-riddled, unrecognizable. For the first time, the Iraqi people saw that the untouchable could be touched. Saddam watched the images on a small battery radio with tears in his eyes. Then he turned it off and whispered they were brave. By autumn, the Americans had narrowed their search to a single area near Tikrit, his birthplace, his fortress of loyalty. They called the mission Red Dawn. On the night of December 13th, soldiers surrounded a farmhouse. They found a small hole in the ground, hidden beneath a rug and a pile of bricks. Inside, they discovered the man who once ruled 25 million souls. He did not fight. When the flashlight hit his face, he blinked like someone waking from a dream. His beard was gray, his clothes dusty. A pistol lay beside him, unused. "I am Saddam Hussein," he said quietly. "I am the president of Iraq." The soldier who captured him replied, "You were." They dragged him from the hole. A man, not a myth. Cameras flashed again. The same lights that had crowned him decades earlier now stripped him bare. Doctors examined him. Soldiers searched him. Journalists shouted questions. The image of the spider hole traveled the world within hours. The once invincible dictator now sat in captivity, disheveled, confused, mortal. In prison, he tried to recover dignity. He demanded respect from his guards, refused blindfolds, quoted scripture. When questioned, he laughed at accusations, denied everything, claimed he had defended his nation against invaders and traitors. History will judge, he said. But history was already judging, live on screens across the world. The Americans built a courtroom inside Baghdad's Green Zone. The Iraqi Special Tribunal, they called it, though everyone knew who truly controlled it. Saddam was charged with crimes against humanity. Massacres, executions, chemical attacks. The witnesses described horrors. Entire villages buried alive, families gasped, prisoners electrocuted. He listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes shouting, "Lies, all lies." He refused to acknowledge the court's authority. "I am still your president," he told the judge. "This is theater, but even theater can end with truth." One by one, his former ministers appeared as witnesses, trembling, broken, eager to survive. The man who had ruled through fear was now surrounded by men who feared no longer. Months turned into years. The trial dragged on, a ritual of humiliation. Saddam's health declined, but his pride did not. He grew a long white beard, spent hours writing letters to his daughters, praying, pacing in his cell. He asked for books, for newspapers, for ink. He still dreamed of return. "If I die," he said once, "I will die standing." In 2006, the verdict came. Guilty. Death by hanging. He listened in silence, nodded once, and smiled. "This is expected," he said. "Long live Iraq." There was no appeal. The date was set, December 30th, the dawn of Eid al-Adha, the holy festival of sacrifice. That morning, guards entered his cell. They found him calm, dressed in black, holding a small Quran. He refused a hood. "Do not be afraid," he told them. "You are only doing your duty." They led him down a corridor into a room lit by yellow bulbs and cameras. A noose waited. Witnesses described his final moments. He recited the Shahada. "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger." His voice was steady. Someone shouted his victims' names. Curses filled the air. He looked at them, eyes unblinking. Then the trapdoor opened. For a second, time stopped. The body swung, then stilled. The cameras cut. Outside, Baghdad woke to another ordinary day. Some rejoiced, some wept. Most simply watched. The man who had ruled through terror was gone, but the terror he built remained. etched into walls, into memories, into the silence of a nation still bleeding. His body was flown to Tikrit, buried in secret. Soldiers guarded the grave, then left. Years later, villagers would whisper that the tomb had been destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again. No one was sure where his bones truly rested, but his shadow never left. In the ruins of his palaces, sand-covered marble floors, his portraits faded, his statues melted into scrap. Children played among the rubble, unaware that once this was forbidden ground. The echoes of his speeches, the drums, the parades, all vanished, leaving only wind and dust. For 3 decades, Saddam Hussein had believed he could command history itself. But history, like the desert, devours everything built upon arrogance. The empire he carved in fear had ended exactly as it began, in silence. And yet, somewhere in that silence, his ghost still lingers, not as a man, not even as a memory, but as a warning carved into the bones of a nation. Power built on fear dies the moment fear itself is gone. When the rope stopped swaying, Iraq stood still. The man who had dominated every breath of the nation was gone, but his absence did not bring peace. Only a different kind of chaos. The morning after his death, Baghdad woke to the sound of gunfire, not celebration. Streets filled with smoke and confusion. Old loyalties collapsed. Old hatreds rose. The dictator was dead, but the fear he had planted had grown roots too deep to pull out overnight. The Americans called it liberation. The Iraqis called it something else. Occupation, invasion, apocalypse, U.S. Tanks patrolled the streets where children had once carried pictures of Saddam in school parades. Checkpoints replaced classrooms. Curfews replaced prayers. Electricity came and went like mercy. The city that once belonged to one man now belonged to no one. In the vacuum of power, factions multiplied. Sunni against Shia, tribe against tribe, brother against brother. Weapons replaced words. In neighborhoods divided by alleys and faith, revenge became a daily ritual. Men disappeared at night. Bodies appeared at dawn. The river carried secrets again, as it had under Saddam, only now the killers were different, and there were too many to count. The American soldiers tried to bring order. They built walls, handed out aid, trained new police. But Iraq was breaking apart faster than they could rebuild it. Every explosion echoed through television screens across the world. Car bombs, markets in flames, mosques reduced to dust. The promise of democracy drowned beneath the weight of vengeance. And in the silence between explosions, people began to remember, not fondly, but with fatigue. Under Saddam, some whispered, "At least we knew who to fear." It was not forgiveness. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes when every door hides danger and every sunrise brings another funeral. In Tikrit, his hometown, they buried him in a tomb of concrete and glass, surrounded by sand and silence. Villagers came secretly at night, leaving flowers, Quran pages, whispers. Others came to curse his name. Soldiers watched from a distance, confused. Was this mourning or rebellion? No one could tell anymore. The war had made grief itself suspicious. His family scattered. Daughters fled abroad. Loyalists went underground. Former generals found work as mercenaries, smugglers, rebels. Some joined the insurgency that rose against the new government, fighting under black flags, claiming they fought for Iraq but often fighting for nothing at all. His image began to reappear. Not as a man to fear, but as a symbol to invoke, a ghost waving from old posters and broken walls. The new leaders promised change. Elections were held. Parliaments formed. Presidents came and went. But corruption spread faster than hope. All money vanished into pockets. Roads remained broken, hospitals empty. The nation that once called itself the heart of the Arab world now beat irregularly, weak and weary. In the countryside, warlords built kingdoms from rubble. Militias controlled neighborhoods. Each flag claimed justice, each gun spoke truth. American patrols grew smaller, quieter, more desperate. And through it all, Saddam's name refused to die. To some, he was the monster who had ruined their lives. To others, he became a myth, the strong hand who had kept the chaos away. Memory twisted itself into contradiction. The Americans eventually left. Their convoys rolled out under orange skies, leaving behind green zones and red scars. They declared their mission complete, but Iraq remained a wound that never closed. Sectarian wars turned into civil wars into something darker. New banners rose, black, not Baathist, but born from the same ashes. Men with covered faces invoked the past as prophecy. The ghosts of Saddam's prisons had learned new languages of terror. In Washington, they spoke of strategy and mistakes. In Baghdad, people spoke of survival. The city that had once bowed to one man now bowed to uncertainty. Markets reopened, then closed again. Schools taught children who had never known peace. A whole generation grew up without a past they could trust or a future they could believe in. And yet, amid the ruins, life persisted. Weddings still happened. Laughter returned in small bursts, fragile but defiant. The call to prayer still rose above the noise, echoing through broken minarets. Time, relentless, kept moving forward, dragging Iraq with it. Years passed. The palaces that Saddam had built began to crumble. The marble cracked, the fountains dried. Some became barracks, others museums, others homes for stray dogs and silence. The great murals that once showed his face were painted over, sometimes with new leaders, sometimes with graffiti. But beneath every layer of paint, the outline remained. Scholars, journalists, and filmmakers came to study him, to explain him, to reduce him to theories. They wrote about tyranny, about ideology, about oil and empire. They measured his crimes in numbers. But numbers could not capture the weight of a single glance in a dark hallway. The fear that once froze a city of millions. They could not explain how a nation could love and hate the same man, sometimes in the same breath. His bloodline faded, but his shadow lingered in the language. Politicians still used his methods. Police still used his prisons. The fear of authority remained a reflex, an instinct carved into the national spine. The sound of boots, the knock at the door, the forced smile. All habits inherited from him. Outside Iraq, the world moved on. New wars began, new names replaced his on the headlines. But every few years, his face returned, on documentaries, on debates, on anniversaries of invasion. He became a question more than a man. Was he evil or inevitable? A product of history or its distortion? No answer satisfied anyone. For the Iraqis who lived through it, he was not a symbol but a memory that refused to fade. A voice that still lingered on old tapes, saying we will never kneel. A face that stared from the corners of their dreams. They had buried his body, but not his influence. His ghost walked beside them, not haunting, just present, as if the past itself refused to die. And so, Iraq rebuilt itself in fragments. New buildings rose beside ruins. New leaders gave speeches that sounded eerily familiar. Each promised unity, strength, dignity. Each failed. The cycle continued. History repeated itself in quieter tones. In the end, Saddam's greatest victory was also his curse. He had made himself inseparable from the country he destroyed. Even dead, he shaped its future by the void he left behind. Iraq could not escape him because too much of it had been built in his image. But time has its own patience. Generations change. Children grow who never saw his face, who know him only through faded photos and the stories of their elders. To them, he is a name from textbooks, a ghost from an age of monsters. They speak of him with curiosity, not fear. That is how history heals. Not through forgetting, but through distance. Still, in certain nights, when the wind moves through the ruins of his palaces and the call to prayer drifts across the river, it feels as if he is still there, watching, waiting, whispering through the cracks of history. The Americans left, the flags changed, the borders shifted, but the lesson he carved remained, carved deep into stone and flesh alike. No ruler can hold a nation by the throat forever. Fear is a weapon that always turns back upon its master. And so Iraq, bruised but breathing, continued onward, not freed, not conquered, but surviving once again beneath the same unending desert sky. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 7, The Echo and the Dust, the final reflect? The years kept moving, as years always do, even over ruins. Time has no mercy and no memory. It erases everything except the echoes. And in Iraq, the echo of one man's voice still drifted through the air like smoke that refused to fade. Children born after his death grew up among his ghosts. They saw his face on torn posters half buried in sand. They heard his name in the trembling voices of their parents, sometimes in anger, sometimes in longing, sometimes in fear they could not explain. For them, Saddam Hussein was not history, he was a rumor, a vibration still humming through the bones of a country that had forgotten how to rest. Baghdad changed. The new skyline rose unevenly, cranes beside craters, neon beside dust. Markets reopened, then burned, then reopened again. The Tigris flowed on, slow and brown, carrying whispers from north to south. Do you remember? The river did. Rivers always do. Journalists came and went. Politicians made promises, built walls, gave speeches about progress. The world turned its cameras elsewhere. New wars, new tyrants, new disasters. But somewhere in every story about power, his shadow appeared, faint but familiar. The mustache, the salute, the staged smile. Symbols that outlived the man himself. In Tikrit, the wind still blows through the ruins of his birthplace. The villagers have learned not to talk much about him. Some still keep his photograph hidden in drawers, not out of love but out of habit. Others curse his name openly, yet still lower their voices when soldiers pass. Silence became the inheritance he left behind. Silence. And the understanding that words can be dangerous. The palaces he built now belong to others. Some became museums of shame, others military bases, some simply fell apart, their marble turning back into dust. Bats live in the ballrooms. Pigeons nest in chandeliers. Rainwater gathers on gold floors and dries beneath the same sun that once glinted off his metals. In those empty halls, one can still feel the weight of presence, not haunting, just residue, like the smell of smoke after fire. Historians debate him endlessly. They call him a dictator, a nationalist, a murderer, a symbol of an age. They analyze his speeches, his wars, his psychology, but their words, precise and careful, cannot capture what it meant to live beneath his gaze. The sound of a door opening at midnight, the silence before an order, the relief of waking up alive. Those memories belong to ordinary people whose names will never be written in books. They are the true witnesses, the keepers of the unspoken history. For them, the fall of Saddam was not an ending but a change of masks. They learned that power has many faces and that tyranny is not always a man. Sometimes it is hunger. Sometimes it is despair. Sometimes it is simply the fear of what might come next. And yet, somewhere deep inside Iraq, in the space where memory meets myth, he remains. Not as the lion he imagined, not as the devil his enemies proclaimed, but as a question. What happens to a nation that confuses obedience with strength? The answer still unfolds year after year, in every broken street light and every child's laughter that rises despite it all. Because life, stubborn and unashamed, continues. Farmers still till the fields he once marched through. Students still recite poetry that was once forbidden. Old soldiers sit in cafes, their medals tarnished, their stories softening with each telling. They speak of him sometimes as if speaking about a storm long past, destructive, unforgettable, but finally gone. Outside, the desert stretches wide and indifferent. It remembers everyone and forgives no one. The dunes shift, covering footprints, uncovering bones. The wind hums through the ruins of old battlegrounds, through rusted tanks and crumbling bunkers, through the ghost towns built on fear and forgotten glory. The sand carries everything. The breath of kings, the ashes of peasants, the dust of empires. And when the wind moves just right, it almost sounds like a whisper. In Baghdad, an old radio still works in a tea shop. Its wires are taped together, its speaker cracked. Sometimes it catches a fragment of a speech from decades ago, a voice declaring victory, promising paradise, demanding loyalty. The customers glance up, then laugh softly. That's him, someone says. The sound fades into static, swallowed by time. He wanted eternity. He wanted to be the sun around which Iraq revolved. But eternity is not given to men. Only to dust, and even dust keeps moving. His name remains carved on a few forgotten plaques, but the letters are fading, eroded by wind, by rain, by indifference. One day, they too will disappear, and perhaps that will be the true end, not the hanging, not the war, but the moment when no one remembers the sound of his name. Still, the world cannot help but look back. There is something magnetic about the abyss he created. Filmmakers reconstruct his life, actors imitate his gestures, documentaries replay his voice. We study tyrants because we fear them, and because we fear how much of them hides within ourselves. The lesson is simple, yet the world keeps forgetting it. Power without mercy always ends the same way, in silence, in exile, in dust. It ends where it began, with a man who thought himself larger than light, standing alone against the wind. And so the story circles back to its beginning. The rope, the silence, the dawn. The echo fades but never quite disappears, because every nation carries its ghosts, and every ghost waits for its echo to return. Maybe somewhere beneath the endless desert sky, a shadow still wanders, not triumphant, not vengeful, just searching for meaning. Perhaps even he, at the end, wondered what it had all been for. The wars, the statues, the blood, the fear. The wind offers no answer. It only moves softly, endlessly, carrying away what men build, scattering their names like sand. And when the sun sets over Baghdad, turning the Tigris to gold one last time, the city exhales, tired, scarred, but still alive. Children chase each other in the fading light, their laughter rising above the call to prayer. Life wins quietly the way it always does. In the distance, the echo fades, and all that remains is the dust. The story ends where it began. Beneath the same sun, over the same earth, Iraq still breathes, scarred and stubborn, a land older than its wounds. Empires have come and gone across this soil. Persians, Ottomans, British, Americans, and each believed they would last forever. None did. The desert remembers them all, but forgives none. Saddam Hussein became part of that memory. Not as a hero, not as a monster, but as proof of how power can twist a man until he becomes a monument to his own fear. He built palaces to eternity, and eternity buried them in sand. He wrote his name in blood, and the rain washed it away. He believed history could be commanded, but history bowed to no one. For 30 years, he ruled through silence, a silence made of whispers, of midnight knocks, of mothers praying their sons would not be taken. That silence was his greatest weapon, and when it broke, it took him with it. Now, his statues are gone, his armies dissolved, his voice reduced to old recordings played by curious hands. Yet his shadow lingers, stretching thin across the generations. A reminder that fear may control bodies, but never hearts. In the evenings, when the call to prayer floats across the rooftops of Baghdad, it mingles with the hum of traffic and the cry of children. Life has returned, fragile but real. Markets open, schools fill, laughter finds its way back into the corners of old streets. Time has softened the scars, though it has not erased them. The people move forward, not forgetting, but carrying the past as a weight and as a warning. Somewhere in the north, wind passes through the ruins of Tikrit. It rustles the weeds growing over cracked marble. It touches a forgotten tomb, and for a heartbeat, it sounds almost like breathing, as if the earth itself exhales, finally letting go. No empire endures. No fear is eternal. The dust takes everything, the crowns, the gold, the names. And in that dust, somewhere between tragedy and memory, lies the final truth of all tyrants. Power dies, but the people remain.